Well, all four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, tell the story of the Gospels. Who is Jesus and why does it matter? And for all four of them, the events of this day that we remember, Jesus being crucified, being buried, being raised, are a pivotal point and the climax, not just of their story, but they're convinced it's a pivotal point and a climax in the story of the whole world. And we shouldn't forget all that is implied in that resurrection story, that life is stronger than death, that love is more triumphant than evil, that true love cannot be defeated by injustice, and that God will have the last word. But it's really easy to make it an event that is stuck in the past so dramatically. And this is one of the reasons why I love Mark's telling of the story, ending as it does in this suspenseful way. How many of you realized when Jack was done reading, the women were standing there, terrorized, deciding to keep quiet and not do what they were told because they were afraid? How many of you realized that the story ended without any actual physical interaction with the risen Jesus? How many of you caught on to that? We've heard all of the other stories, the lovely story of Jesus calling Mary's name, the wonderful story of Jesus having fish on the beach with the disciples, Jesus coming through the doors and into the upper room and breathing the breath of life into the disciples. But Mark's story ends with this big precipice. And that is actually the ending of his gospel. It's not an April Fool's joke. He actually ends with the women being frightened and deciding to keep quiet, though they've been given instructions to go and speak. And I decided that this year, this gospel really spoke to me because I related to the women's position, kind of standing on the edge of decision, the edge of a choice between living by fear or living by faith, the choice between being stuck, even if miserably, but stable in grief and ambiguity, or taking a leap into fear, out of fear, into obedience and adventure, looking for a higher life based on the promises of Jesus. So let's strip away all of those other Easter stories that we've heard and hear again Mark's story. The women have come to the tomb to anoint the body, and they're worried about getting the stone rolled away. All of the other disciples, the men, have disappeared from the scene. These women were with the men from the beginning in Galilee and followed them down, were part of the entourage. But perhaps they weren't as much at risk. So the other disciples had fled and the women were there to go express their grief and to anoint the body. They were worried as they were headed that way about whether or not they'd be able to get that stone rolled away. And were surprised when they got there that the stone had indeed been rolled away. And then they saw a young man. Not a dazzling angel, but a young man dressed in white who repeated for them the words that Jesus had told his disciples often, that he would suffer, be crucified, be buried, and then on the third day he would be raised. And then would want to meet with them back in Galilee, where they should catch up with him. The angel-like person, young man, simply tells the women what they'd already heard and puts the empty grave in the context of the fulfillment of Jesus' promises. And then tells them, you are supposed to go ahead and tell Peter, who, remember, as we last heard, had denied Jesus 3 times, and the other disciples who had fled, go to Galilee and tell them that Jesus will meet them there as they work. And the women hear those words, and they're afraid, and they're trying to decide what to do. But as we last hear, they are not telling anyone. Every time I hear the ending of that story, now I want you to know that that was very unsatisfying to some of the early Christians, because they wrote 2 more endings to put onto the Gospel of Mark, but scholars are pretty sure that Mark intended to speak to us with the ending in ambiguity. And why would Mark do that? Because he's speaking to us in every generation almost exactly as we are. We also are here at this point of remembering the resurrection, hearing about the empty tomb, and being faced with the choice of trusting based on the words and promises of Jesus and some circumstantial evidence and the testimony of others that doesn't fill in all the gaps and nail down every uncertainty. And yet we're called to overcome whatever resistance and fear we have, to be obedient and go and meet him in the places from which we come. Every time I hear the story, I wonder, what would have happened if the women had just kept quiet? Now, obviously they didn't, because the story is told. But what would have happened if they hadn't done their part? If they hadn't risen to occasion of a new level of responsibility? Up to that point, they had been just kind of support services for the men as they moved around. But they were being given this crucial link in the chain to go and tell the disciples where they were supposed to go to hook up with Jesus. What would the world be like if there was not faith? And so it got me thinking about what's involved just in faith and the gift of a life of faith. I recently read, I'm a big fan of Jimmy Carter, and he's a very deeply Christian person whose faith has guided so much of what he's done with his life, both in public service and in official capacity, but then in his incredible public service in his non-presidential or non-elected capacities. And his recent book is just called Faith, A Journey for All. And he talks about faith being a gift. It's one of our fundamental affirmations that faith is a gift. It's God reaching out to us in love, and it's a gift. But there's also an aspect of it that is some choice. And it engages our minds, but also takes us beyond the limit of our minds. And Jimmy Carter asserts throughout this book, and I find it really kind of persuasive, and maybe why it speaks to me today about our situation. He really seems to think that there's a connection between a serious faith in God and having faith in ourselves as individuals and having faith in one another as a society, and in having faith in the values, in moral values that can bind people together. He actually says, I wonder if humanity can survive without faith in ourselves, in one another, or in the basic principles of life. Can the moral values of democracy, freedom, justice, equality, and compassion be transmitted to the next generation without religious faith? I hope so, but I'm confident that religious faith enhances the possibility of that transmission. When I think about our world today and all of the anger and reactivity and fear that is driving it, I wonder if he isn't onto something, that it's really about a lack of faith. Faith in a good and loving, life-giving God whose benevolence is meant for all. So faith is a gift, but on the precipice, there's also something of a choice about it. I don't know if any of you heard this week, as I did, on some, I think interviewed on Ann Fisher, there was a person by the name of Stephen Kusisto who wrote a book called Have Dog Will Travel, A Poet's Journey. And he is a gentleman who was born blind, legally blind, but able to see some in a time in which his very intellectual, emotionally distant parents believed that it was important for people to not act like they had a disability. And so he was raised in a family that was constantly trying to tell him to fake being able to see and pretend like he was normal so that either he wouldn't bring others' condemnation down on him, or he wouldn't seem weak, or perhaps he wouldn't make them feel embarrassed. And he talks about his life's huge transition after 38 years of living in situations where he could live in a small enough town, on a small enough course of progress from home to work and his work all around his workplace, and so that he could kind of stumble his way and act like he was seeing when he couldn't see, keeping his life narrowly confined, never trying to let on, never using a cane so that anyone would think that he was disabled. And he talks about how small his life was and what an incredible transition it was when he got a guide dog and started learning to accept himself as a blind person and to accept the help of a guide dog and expand his surroundings. So it's actually a story about faith, but I was struck by the analogy between his journey and so much of what basic Christian faith and life is about. And at several points in his story, I found connections. First of all, he talks about faith in a sense of being a kind of choice simply to choose life. His family, no one in his family went to church. His mother was an alcoholic, and he was an incredibly unhappy child, very unnurtured by love and affection, provided for well, but really lacking in nurture and care. When he was bullied in school, and by the time he was 17, he was just profoundly despairing about his life, and he stopped eating. He just decided to stop eating. And he became really, really ill from stopping eating. And his family kind of took notice, sent him to a psychiatric hospital for a week. They decided they couldn't do anything with him. They sent him back, and he kind of continued anemic, hovering on the edge of life and death. And then he said in this little town where he lived, a little college town in New England, one morning against all odds, he decided to go to church, which no one in his family ever did. And there he sat in the pews, surrounded by people that he kind of knew were associated with the university. Some of the other faculty were in the pews, but he didn't know them. And he ruminates that, he said, my blindness was a problem. Certainly, I was the reason my mother drank and took pills. Surely my ruined eyes were the source of her despair. Surely if I was just a better child, less defective, or more successful at covering up my deficiencies, why then all would be better. I bore the weight of all of that on my shoulders. I was 17 and already an old man. But as he sat there, he warmed to the kindness and warmth in the minister's words, and the next thing he knew it was time for communion, about which he knew nothing. But he followed the instructions, and he said, I went to the altar rail, got down on my knees, reached out, and took the bread. Take and eat, for this is my body. It was the sacrament of Christ's flesh and blood. My fingers were anemic as I took the bread, and my hands shook. Come, risen Lord, and deign to be our guest. I remember the words, I am the bread of life. Do this in remembrance of me. How could I explain? Certainly I was a starving, blind adolescent, chilled in April light, 1 foot from death, who felt a heat inside, who felt his own blood and flesh kissed from somewhere deep and still. And he goes on to write, I decided to live from that day forward, but I never mentioned the experience to anyone. So many years later, he loses his job as a college professor in this little town and is faced with not being able to find anything else. He can no longer move in his stable little world where he can pretend to be sighted and be believed. And he has to venture out beyond. We'll pick up more of his story later. But life, faith is a gift, and it's also, though, a choice to receive it and live. It's like choosing for life. Not turning off any doubts or questions. Doubts are part of a genuine faith, but fear is not. Choosing life. Faith is also accepting Galilee. It's so interesting that the young man who talked to the women and gave them instructions told them that if they wanted to hook up with Jesus, they needed to go back to their hometown, which is where life goes on. They'd come to Jerusalem for all of the action, the center of the government, the center of the temple. It was like all of the God stuff was in that place. But Jesus was going to meet all of them back in Galilee. It was a region, not a town. It was a region. The people who followed Jesus had been gathered up by hearing him and deciding to follow him from their different towns in the region around Galilee. They were supposed to go back to their lives, but to live that life with Jesus. We are called to live our faith, not in this lovely place that feeds us and nourishes us, but in the places where we live. And if we were to name them all, the places we all come from to be at this place, it's all over central Ohio. It's even farther than just Franklin County. We live in places where we are surrounded by communities with all sorts of needs, and that is where Jesus will really meet us. We each will have our own kind of risen Christ story when we go back and try to meet him, engaging in the work of the places where we live. Faith is accepting Galilee, but it's not about being there alone. I think maybe one of the reasons I related to this passage so much this time is I felt like I was being called to think about my work differently. Recently, I go, as John does, every week we go to Hubbard and do with a reading buddy, sit with a reading buddy. And I think with this group I asked you for prayers a few weeks ago for my reading buddy Antonio, who really caught me off guard. I had a chance to work with him for several months. I'd been working with some of the other ones, but he'd been in and out of the classroom, always with someone else helping or not there. And I hadn't seen him for a while, and one Wednesday I came and I was shocked at how poorly he was doing. I'd really thought we were kind of making progress, but he was really, really down in the dumps. Second grader, really despairing about himself. I tried to give him the kind of usual pep talk that I always do, but he was not having it. He said, they've been telling me I'm dumb for 2 years since first grade. He's only in second grade. Since first grade, and now I just believe them. And we didn't really try to do too much work. We talked and tried to pep him up, but I wasn't getting anywhere. And I left there really worried and driven to my knees to pray for him and ask others to pray for him, which I couldn't believe I hadn't been doing already. And I asked others to pray for him, and I went and talked to the teacher after school to find out if he was getting extra help, if his parents were aware. She was also a little bit befuddled about what was going on. So I went back the next week, and Antonio, as soon as I walked into the room, I usually start with another person. He waved his hands like, "Come get me, come get me." And first thing he says, I'm doing better. I'm going to try. We're really going to work. I've decided I can do this. And I was kind of surprised, delighted. And I looked over and I said, I've been really worried about you. I prayed for you all week. And he looks up like this and he goes, "Well, then I got to tell you it works." And I thought to myself, why do I spend so much time trying to do the Lord's work without the Lord's help? We are not called to our places in Galilee to engage the hard things around us by ourselves. It's actually when we have our engagement with our work that Jesus gives us in Galilee, it's actually when we meet him. He's already there. Mark didn't give the resurrection experiences because he knew his hearers would all have their own. Faith is meant to be a kind of companionable walk with Christ, where we are uplifted and supported in the midst of our obedience. Jimmy Carter says faith encompasses a real trusting in Jesus. Christian faith always achieves contemporaneousness with Christ. Those who have this faith feel that we and Jesus are always living together. We feel more closely connected to Jesus than we are with those who are now living. I have no doubt that Jesus is living now, he says. To me, Christ is not an object to be worshipped, but a person and a constant companion. And back to the story of Stephen Kosciuszko. He talked about getting a guide dog, and I wish Adam were here. We have somebody here, Adam Richmond, who's normally sitting right about there, who trains pilot dogs. And one of the things that was so impressive about Stephen Kosciuszko's description of getting a guide dog was that he said it actually made him feel so supported to have this trained companion who was kind of preventing him from harm and communicating with him constantly aware of his needs. And he got to know not only how to work with the dog, but he found out how the dogs are prepared to become trained dogs. And it was explained to him that these dogs are prepared by being in homes that absolutely surround them with love and attention. And the dog itself was kind of a constant reminder of the energy that comes from walking in companionship undergirded by love. And as he started to lean in and trust that companionship, his world expanded. He could go anywhere, face anyone, because the love gave him confidence in himself, in others, in the future. And that's what Christ is meant for us. He lives and he's risen because he wants to be our companion as we go about doing his work in the places where we live and in our families, in our communities, in our workplaces. So go. You will find him in Blacklick, Pataskala, Pickerington, downtown Columbus, Grandview, Upper Arlington, Obetz, Worthington, Lewis Center, Powell, Grove City, New Albany. Am I leaving anyone out? Hilltop, Clintonville, Hilliard, Gahanna, Bexley, Campus, Youngstown. Woo! Go. The risen Christ is there. You'll find him, and it will lift up your work for him and undergird it all with joy. May it be so. Happy Easter.
Yeah, we haven't